It was quote that I see we're putting together.
People need to know my.
Great.
Do I? Hello, everyone. Hello. How's everybody doing? Good. It's Thursday. Weekend's coming up. It's good. Apologize. I'm a little under the weather, so if I sound a little, more congested than normal, I already speak nasally, so apologize if I'm even more nasally than usual. My name is Owen Duckworth. I'm a coalition organizer. I'm at the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability. I'll give you a quick introduction to the organization. For those who aren't familiar, we are a coalition organization made up of 30-plus member groups, a mixture of place-based organizations and cultural community-focused organizations, as well as issue advocacy organizations. And we work on primarily public transit, affordable housing, jobs, and regional development, regional growth issues with a racial justice focus. So that's my elevator speech on our organization. I'm getting better at it. I'm a year and a half in now, so it's improving by the month, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing that feels relevant to the issues of equity in housing and transit systems. And there's sort of two areas I've spent most of my time. There's one I may name, but I don't really want to get too much into it since it's a little more complicated. In all honesty, I'm still figuring it out. But the main project that I've been working on in my time at the Alliance so far has been the Fair Housing and Equity Assessment, which is something that some people in the room are familiar with. A lot of others are probably not at all. So the other piece I'll be talking about then is some of the transit funding campaign work that the Alliance has been involved in, and that's, and I should say at this point, transportation funding work, but specifically the Alliance has been part of Transit Partners Coalition, which is convened by Transit for Livable Communities, that's been working on trying to get an additional 3/4 cent sales tax in the region to build out the public transit system. So I'll talk about the Fair Housing Equity Assessment first, then talk about some of the transit funding work, then try to answer some of these other questions that have been put before me. So the FHEA, in short, the FHEA, there's sort of a technical piece and there's something that's hopefully a little more interesting about it. Basically, this is a document that's been a requirement of the Met Council as a grantee of HUD Sustainable Communities grant that they received a few years ago. And in short, the Fair Housing Equity Assessment, I'll refer to it as the FHEA, does sort of an opportunity mapping of the region. So it looks at places in the region where there's sort of an intersection of people of color, more than 50% people of color, and more than 40% people living below the poverty line. And what it looks at then is how different communities are connected to different types of opportunity. So it's called opportunity mapping. That's kind of the more technical part. The more interesting part, and the reason why the Alliance and we partnered with CURA, Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the U of M, and then a number of place-based organizational partners and allies, some of whom are member organizations of the Alliance, some of whom are allies. So we worked with, basically because we saw this as an opportunity to have a different conversation with a different set of community leaders around the intersection of public housing and transit and regional growth issues, as well as really a conversation that was going to take place inside of a regional governmental organization like the Metropolitan Council, essentially on race and equity. And that was something that we knew had not been happening, and we knew that if there was not a different set of eyes and a different set of voices included in that process, that conversation was not going to be looked at in depth and was not going to be taken seriously. And that's not a jab at the Met Council. That's just how these things work. So that's some of the work that we've been doing. And without getting into too many of the details of what that work has looked like, we've essentially convened a table around that of organizational leaders, and worked to as there's been initial draft of the Fair Housing Equity Assessment to sort of push on some of what the framing for these issues were. And a lot of the conversation, when people are familiar with sort of the affordable housing, regional affordable housing conversation, there's been this ongoing debate sort of around place-based strategies, so investments in historically disinvested communities, primarily low wealth, low income communities, communities of color, and mobility strategies. So in other words, creating housing opportunities in suburban areas where schools tend to get better results, not necessarily for students of color, but that's a different issue. So there's been this has been an ongoing conversation. Now, frequently that conversation has not been one that's been inclusive of people who are going to be most impacted by those policies, first of all. Excuse me here. And secondly, that's a conversation that can be very, very much based in legal in legal terms, rather than one that's accessible to community. And also doesn't really get to some of the root cause of these things, which is essentially racism, institutionalized and structural racism. So if we're not having those so again, we felt like this is an opportunity to shift that conversation to one that's really about what's at the core of the inequities in our region around a system like housing, and certainly as it overlaps with others. Excuse me here. So there's been a bit of a shift, consequently, because of some of the work that we've been doing and a number of the allies we partnered with, that there's a shift in some of this conversation. The Met Council has revised this document. Thank you very much. And I mean, and I should say as well that the greater focus of this work, as much as I'm talking about it in this idea of shifting the conversation, is really how do we get the Met Council to begin seeing themselves as accountable to historically underrepresented communities, and institutionalizing that practice, institutionalizing that accountability. And that's an ongoing piece that I think on all sides, I think there's a different degree of political will that we've seen, certainly with this Metropolitan Council, so I want to applaud them for that. But in terms of, on all sides, there needs to be both some stronger models, some still stronger political will, and some flexibility internally within the council that still needs to take place. So I think that's one example of one thing that I'm working on, and that the alliance with a number of partners. We're a coalition organization. The way we do our work is building coalition. The way we try to end up at the end of the day is making sure that as we partner with people, we walk away from those relationships, that there's a shared sense of ownership in the work, there's a shared sense of power being built amongst organizations as well. So I want to just call that out as well. I'll move on to some of the transit pieces quickly. So the Alliance, as I mentioned as well, we're part of the Move Minnesota Coalition. And we've been working with transit partners for a number of years. I previously worked, full disclosure, at Transit for Livable Communities, as well as an organizer. So I have a deep connection to this issue for a number of years now. This is, as I mentioned, there's a focus on trying to get an additional 3/4 cent or half-cent sales tax in the region. I don't even know if I'm supposed to be calling out the funding mechanism at this point, but we're all friends here, so so I trust you guys. But in short, this is again an interesting. As many people who've done work and sort of statewide coalitions or issue advocacy coalitions, there's a real tension at the heart of a lot of these issues, especially when it comes to race equity issues. We know that using, well, first of all, I'll call it the obvious. A lot of the issue advocacy organizations in our state and in our region are not led by people of color, are not necessarily based in an analysis that leads with race equity. And that's, I'm going to call that out because I think that needs to be stated. There's also these issues also certainly impact, especially when we're talking about public transit, people in communities of color. There's also a challenge in terms of when building these coalitions, we know where, in order to build a coalition to work on an issue like this, there's a number of players that need to be at the table. Not all of them certainly share a racial equity analysis. That's an understatement. Many of them are literally turned off by the conversation around race, right? Or anything that's seen as benefiting low-income people, low-wealth people, people of color, any underrepresented community. We actually know that becomes reason for them to not support something. So that's a tension that's there. But again, for the Alliance, as we put racial equity in front and center in our mission and hold that lens wherever we go, it's a challenge, again, to how we think about building power within for our member organizations we're working with, for our own organization, for communities on the ground. So I'll leave it at that for now, and then try to get to a couple of the points very quickly. How much time do I have, by the way? A few minutes? Okay. So a couple of other questions then that were asked here, of what else do I think needs to be done at sort of individual grassroots systems level around these issues. So loosely, I think I'll start at grassroots. I think more capacity needs to be developed at a community or grassroots level. Communities of color, indigenous communities, people with disabilities, other underrepresented groups. There needs to be an intentionality of building leadership within those communities, and an investment from a number of different places in building leadership within those communities, because there's not enough representation, legitimate representation, at most decision-making tables, and that's one of the ways, anyways, in which institutional and structural racism works, and excluding people who are going to be impacted in communities who are going to be impacted by this. So that's front and center. And to that point as well, organizing around, for instance, and I'm thinking again on transit and housing issues, transit rider organizing. I know there's some work, I think, that Neighborhoods Organizing for Change is beginning to get off the ground around some transit rider organizing. That's, I think, absolutely essential in the region. Tenant organizing, I know there's some organizations doing that, but again, figuring out ways to deepen that. And I mean, in all honesty, the BCLI model as well is powerful of thinking about, so where are some of the targeted boards and commissions and that people need to be placed on, and how can you get people most powerfully placed there and able to wield personal power and community power there? I think that's an essential thing. So I just want to commend that. In terms of systems, and then I'll sort of jump back to individual, and I want to say a little bit about advocacy organizations as well in that. Systems, I think there's a need to be more flexible in terms of how decisions get made, and flexible both by the process, the timeline, the resources committed, because I think there needs to be a recognition that if institutions and if systems are going to say we're going to lead with an equity lens, or we're going to focus with equity now, they need to say that one of the key principles is to not have decisions made for people without them at the table, but really commit to putting those resources and putting that time and putting that energy into engaging people, and to make sure that as these processes take place, that people really understand the impacts for themselves and for their community. So it's not simply, again, the standard sort of tokenized community engagement that unfortunately happens a lot and leaves people feeling disempowered. And as an organizer, that's one of the most frustrating things, is when you tell people this is a process that you need to be at the table at, and then they come to the table, and then they walk away from the table feeling less empowered than when they even came in, saying, you just wasted my time. So that's problematic for all of us. The other thing as well, and this is, getting comfortable having uncomfortable conversations about race and class and power. And I think owning institutional racism. And I don't mean that in like a wallowing in, like this, we're racist. Like that's not a productive place. But I think owning the fact that this exists and it's real, and that unless there's an intentional work around it, it's not going to change. So I'll finally move on to a couple other points here. I think around sort of the individual, one of the things that I think about, what I try to ask myself when I'm doing this work, is really being honest about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. For an example, in some of the fair housing equity assessment work that I've done, we've done this past year and a half. I try to be very clear that what we're doing is coalition building around this issue, but it's with a specific set of institutions rooted in community, not with community broadly, right? And it's important to have that distinction, because one, that means that I then don't put myself or put other leaders in positions where they are supposed to speak for their entire community, or speak from an equity angle that allows people to check the box, myself included, and I think that's really an important thing to be clear on. So we have to be honest about what we're actually doing. the other piece is who am I in relationship with, and who am I accountable to? And again, this goes kind of back to the previous point as well, that those of us doing any level of work, especially those of us who are fortunate enough to get paid to do organizing or advocacy work, we're always going to be in positions where we're going to be asked to be speaking for somebody else, or we're going to be asked to be presenting a perspective that's going to impact somebody who's not us, and potentially not our communities. So I think asking ourselves, okay, so what are my real relationships, and how accountable am I to those relationships, right? If I slip up, there better be somebody who I'm accountable to call me out on that. And also somebody who's hopefully informing my opinion, and I'm hopefully somebody else who I can open up a door for so they can come in. So I don't have to be at some of these places. And that's back again to even the leadership development piece, right? It's flattering to be asked to be at tables at the Metropolitan Council or the city or the county, but I don't think any of us have the time to do that. We want different people there, right? So that's another piece of it. And I'll try to answer then finally, just the last question is, what do you need from community besides money, in parentheses, because I would definitely say. And I was struggling a little bit, I guess, with what this meant by community, whether it was sort of broadly, on the ground community, whether this was sort of nonprofit, philanthropy, I don't know the scope of it. But I'll share a couple things. So I think community expertise and narratives is something that I guess I need, and I think we collectively doing this work need. And again, thinking about transit and housing issues, there's people who are impacted most by these issues or by these systems are rarely given credit for being experts in dealing with these inequities or dealing with the their day-to-day lives, interacting with public transit or public housing or affordable housing. So creating spaces collectively, whether that's grassroots organizations partnering with advocates or vice versa, Met Council or the county or other systems, creating space where there's, again, legitimate opportunities for people impacted to be at those tables in powerful ways. I think that's something that's needed. People who get tabbed as experts, and again, we need the legal experts. We need the policy wonks at all these issues as well. So it's not to dismiss that expertise, but it's a different set of expertise, and I think we need to acknowledge that. And then a little shameless self-promotion here as well, but I'm happy to talk more about the Fair Housing Equity Assessment process, and this is something that is at a point, especially if you're working at a community level. This next phase of the process is actually very, very potentially powerful. The Metropolitan Council is going to be hosting meetings across a number of communities of color in the region, talking about reinvestment strategies. These are supposed to be multi-jurisdictional, so city, county, Met Council, philanthropic partners, community organizations, talking about reinvestment strategies. And this has been part of the shift that we've seen, is that there's a recognition now that's in this process that part of what the reasons we have seemingly isolated pockets of communities of color and low wealth people is because of institutionalized racism, because of historic disinvestment. So we got to have a conversation about both those things together. So that's a piece. So that's one piece. So I just invite people to that process. And then the other piece, of course, is the transit campaign that we're working on as well. And again, there's a lot of tension in this as well. As I mentioned, there's a lot of tension that people feel around what happens when we give entities like MnDOT, like the Metropolitan Council or Metro Transit, more resources. Where do those go? Who benefits? Is there going to be equity in how these are divided up? What happens when the rubber meets the road in terms of, or the tracks meet the road in terms of, literally in terms of new transit infrastructure, new transportation infrastructure? Who gets those jobs? Do people get displaced? Who's small businesses? Which communities have access to building small businesses and wealth? So those are just a couple of things I think is again, I think any of us, I would think, would say that we always need partnership. We always need people. So I think that's, even as I name these specific things I'm working on shamelessly, I also think it is real that that working together with people, is really important on this stuff. So I'll leave it at that because I know I probably took a little more time than I should. So, but appreciate it.